Evil was the only word for it, because what was done to Henry, Jenny, and Emily Hahn in their own home while they slept wasn't rage, it wasn't desperation, it was calculated, deliberate, and carried out by a man they had trusted enough to let through their front door. And Emily was 3 days from turning 6. On the evening of March 23, 2016, a welfare check at a quiet home in Goleta, California, just outside Santa Barbara, led sheriff's deputies to one of the most disturbing discoveries in the county's history. 3 bodies, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, stacked in the family garage. The smell of bleach hung heavy through the upstairs rooms. Bedding had been stripped from every bed and loaded into the washing machine. Someone had spent hours trying to erase what they had done. Investigators knew immediately this was no random act. The cleanup was too deliberate, the planning too precise. Someone had been inside that house, not as an intruder, but as a guest, and they had used that access to carry out something unthinkable. What they didn't know yet was who, or why. To understand that, you first have to understand who this family was: Santa Barbara, California. The kind of place people imagine when they dream about the good life: the Pacific at your back, the Santa Ynez Mountains ahead, streets lined with Spanish tile architecture and bougainvillea. It was the kind of town where a healer could thrive. Henry Hahn had come a long way to get there. He immigrated from China, where he had grown up in a family of physicians, and arrived in the United States carrying that same calling. He studied, built his practice, and eventually took over the Santa Barbara Herb Clinic, a place that, under his care, became something people traveled hundreds of miles to reach. Dr. Glenn Miller, a psychiatrist who partnered with Henry on a book about Eastern and Western medicine, described a man who had earned the deep trust of his patients, not through theatrics, but through results. In fact, countless patients can attest to just how remarkable he was. Take Sherry Baron, a young mother battling cancer when she discovered Henry's clinic. Her daughter was only 15 months old. She went through surgery and chemotherapy, but she credits Henry's holistic approach with helping her survive the toughest part of her journey. He didn't replace conventional medicine. He stood alongside it, held the hands of the frightened, and helped them believe they could make it through. Kimberly Ruff had a similar story. Diagnosed with thyroid cancer shortly after giving birth, she says Henry found a way for her to continue nursing her newborn while still treating her tumors. So Henry Hahn wasn't just a healer. He was, for hundreds of people across Southern California and beyond, a reason to keep going. In 2009, Henry's personal life caught up with the contentment of his professional one. He met Jenny Yu. Friends who knew them both said it was immediately clear she was exactly right for him. Warm, organized, quick to laugh, she took over the operational side of the clinic, becoming Henry's right hand in every sense. His friend and longtime confidant Don Goldberg, who had known Henry for more than 25 years and considered him a brother, described watching Henry's world come together. And then little Emily, their only child, arrived. Emily had her own little table at the clinic, her crayons, her drawings. She followed her parents through their days like a small, cheerful shadow. In the spring of 2016, she was weeks away from turning 6, and her loved ones were already planning her birthday party. Now it's important to note that by 2015 and into 2016, Henry was also looking outward, toward a new business opportunity that excited him. He had been using CBD in his practice for years, treating pain and inflammation in his patients, and he wanted to harness its potential on a larger scale. He partnered with Mark and Marla Palumbo, who worked in the skincare industry, to develop a CBD-based product line. It was a promising collaboration, and it's the reason we know what we know about the days leading up to the murders. Because Henry had a 10 a.m. meeting scheduled with the Palumbos on March 23, 2016, and he never showed up. For the record, Henry Hahn was not a man who was late without calling. He was, by every account from the people who knew him, the kind of person who apologized for being 2 minutes behind schedule, missing an important meeting entirely, and going to voicemail wasn't absent-mindedness. It was a warning sign. By midday, Don Goldberg decided to drive to the house himself. From the outside, it looked normal. Both vehicles were in the garage. The front door was unlocked but closed. Don called out, but there was no response. So he called 911. When the garage door opened, deputies found what would begin one of the most haunting investigations in Santa Barbara County history. 3 bodies, wrapped tightly in plastic sheeting and duct tape, stacked in the garage of a quiet suburban home. Within moments, it became clear who they were. That evening, Santa Barbara Sheriff's investigators obtained a search warrant and began the painstaking work of piecing together what had happened inside the Hahn family home. The picture that emerged was devastating. It appeared the family had been shot while they slept. Henry in the master bedroom, Jenny and Emily across the hall in Emily's room. The evidence suggested Jenny had been reading to her daughter before bed and had stayed with her through the night. The killer had not acted impulsively and fled. He had stayed. He had cleaned. Bleach bottles were found throughout the upstairs. Bleach stains marked the carpet and other surfaces. The bedding had been stripped from every bed and loaded into the washing machine, where it was still sitting when investigators arrived, the machine's alarm having triggered because the load was unbalanced. Inside pillows bundled into the laundry, crime scene investigators found a .22 caliber bullet and bullet fragments. 3 matching shell casings were found within the plastic wrapping around Jenny's body. One more was later recovered, lodged between the baseboard and box spring of Emily's bed. The smell of bleach was everywhere. This was not the scene of a panicked crime. This was the scene of someone who had thought carefully about what came after. And then, next to Henry's bed, investigators found something that would crack the case open. It was a document, 4 pages, signed on the last day Henry Hahn was seen alive, a business contract drawn up between 2 partners. One signature belonged to Dr. Henry Hahn. The other belonged to a man named Pierre Haobsh. Pierre Haobsh was 25 years old in the spring of 2016. To people who didn't know him well, he could seem like someone on the verge of something extraordinary. A young scientist with bold ideas, an inventor who talked about energy technology in terms that suggested he was operating a few years ahead of everyone else. He had a way of making you feel like you were lucky to be in the room with him. Henry Hahn, whose entire career was built on believing in people's potential for something better, had taken a liking to Pierre after meeting him through a mutual contact. He wanted Pierre to help develop his CBD research, and Pierre, who claimed laboratory expertise and scientific knowledge well beyond his years, seemed like the right person to help. However, the Palombos were not convinced. Their discomfort grew when the lab work began producing results that didn't add up. Pierre, they discovered, was using toxic materials. When confronted, he gave a vague explanation about learning more about the molecules. Then came the credit card charges, flagged by Marla, who handled the finances. The charges turned out to be for escort services, billed to Henry's account without his knowledge, and Henry's reaction was immediate. That should have been the end of it. But then, a few weeks before the murders, Henry mentioned Pierre's name again. He had learned more about Pierre's difficult childhood, he said. He felt sympathy for what the young man had overcome. He was considering giving him another chance. Henry's friend Isaiah Oregon had a similar conversation with Jenny just 4 days before the murders. Jenny was wrestling with it. Do we trust him again? Do we give him another chance? But Pierre had already found his way back in. And this time, he had a new angle. He told Henry he had late-stage cancer. Henry Hahn, who had spent his entire career helping sick people heal, opened his door to the man who had stolen from him because that man claimed to be dying. And guess what? Pierre was not dying. He was lying, and he was already planning what came next. 6 days before the murders, March 17, 2016, Pierre Haobsh began searching online for information about impersonating Dr. Henry Hahn at his bank. He looked up Asian disguises. He searched for realistic face masks. While there is no evidence he ever purchased a mask, what he did purchase 4 days before the murders is documented on a time-stamped receipt and confirmed by security video. A .22 caliber pistol with a threaded barrel, specifically designed to accommodate a silencer, along with a suppressor and ammunition bought at a gun store in Arizona. On March 20th, he was in Oceanside, California, buying supplies. He then drove north to the Hahn family home, where he had arranged to stay as a guest while working on what he described as a new energy machine he was installing for Henry. While in the house, in the days before the murders, investigators later found evidence that Pierre had installed a keylogger on Henry's personal computer. A keylogger records every keystroke, every search, every password entered on a device. Pierre was harvesting Henry's banking credentials from inside Henry's own home. And on March 21st, still a guest in Dr. Hahn's house, Pierre's own laptop recorded the searches he was running. He was searching for the most efficient way to kill the family whose home he was sleeping in. On March 22nd, Pierre signed the business contract with Henry and left. Prosecutors allege he returned in the early hours of March 23rd, around 4 a.m., and carried out the murders while the family slept. He then spent hours attempting to clean up the scene. He stripped the beds, he poured bleach, he moved the bodies to the garage, wrapping them in plastic sheeting and duct tape he had purchased at a Home Depot in Oceanside days earlier. and then he began trying to drain Henry's accounts, using the banking credentials he had stolen through the keylogger, along with Henry's wallet, credit card, and social security number. A Chase Bank fraud alert flagged an attempted transfer of $72,000. Pierre's plan was not to vanish immediately. He planned to clean the scene thoroughly, move the bodies, and buy himself enough time to drain the accounts before anyone noticed Henry was gone. But there was one thing he hadn't calculated: the 10 a.m. meeting. By mid-morning on March 23rd, while the Palombos were still trying to understand why Henry wasn't answering his phone, Pierre Haobsh was already on the move, driving south on the California coast toward Oceanside, where he shared a residence with his father. At 9:39 that morning, he sent a text message to a man named T.J. Derrida. T.J. was a marijuana grower who had met Dr. Hahn through the CBD research project and who had befriended Pierre along the way some people befriend a kid who seems like he's trying too hard to be impressive. The text said Pierre needed help moving something and needed to talk face-to-face. He said he was in Santa Barbara. He asked T.J. to meet him. T.J. agreed, and Pierre drove to his home in Thousand Oaks, about an hour away. T.J. Derrida sat with that information. He wasn't certain whether this was another one of Pierre's elaborate stories. The man had a well-established habit of inventing dramatic narratives about himself. So T.J. played along. He listened. He said he'd think about it. Pierre gave him details. The bodies had been too heavy to move on his own. Henry, in particular, had been difficult to manage. He described the wrapping. He described the layout of the house. Pierre also told T.J. his motive: $20 million. That was what he believed he could extract from Henry Hand's accounts now that Henry was no longer alive to stop him. When Pierre left T.J.'s house, T.J. started making calls, trying to reach anyone who might know where Henry was, trying to confirm whether what he'd just heard could possibly be true. By the time he was certain it was, investigators were already processing the crime scene. Meanwhile, Pierre kept texting. Around 5 p.m., when T.J. still hadn't agreed to help him, Pierre sent a new proposition: a last-minute trip to Las Vegas. T.J. made an excuse and declined. Pierre sent one final text at 7:35 that evening. By that time, investigators had already secured the Hahn residence. When Pierre drove back to the house with a large rented truck, intending to move the bodies, he found police tape and officers everywhere. Investigators had identified Pierre Haobsh as a person of interest within hours of arriving at the crime scene. A detective noticed the packaging material. The plastic sheeting used to wrap the bodies was a Home Depot brand. Working with the company's security department, they were able to cross-reference recent purchases of both the plastic wrap and the matching duct tape in the Southern California region. Security footage from a Home Depot in Oceanside showed a man matching Pierre Haobsh's DMV photo walking out with 3 large rolls of plastic wrap and duct tape. Oceanside was also Pierre's home address. Data from the Hahn family's missing cell phones told them where Pierre was heading. The phones had been traveling south, further and further from Santa Barbara. Henry's phone went dark at a certain point, but Jenny's phone kept moving south, a dead woman's phone creating a digital trail straight toward Oceanside. A manhunt was underway by the following morning. Law enforcement from the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Office worked alongside Oceanside police, conducting surveillance on the residence Pierre shared with his father. Shortly after midnight, undercover units watched Pierre's father drive to a Walmart parking lot, where security cameras captured him meeting Pierre in the parking lot and transferring 2 large duffel bags from one car to another. The arrest team intercepted Pierre Haobsh at a gas station shortly after. Pierre Haobsh was in custody less than 48 hours after the Hahn family was murdered. In his car, Henry's wallet, credit card, and social security number. The Hahn family's missing cell phones and tablet, wrapped in aluminum foil in an attempt to block tracking signals. And in the trunk, beneath a false floor where a spare tire would normally sit, the murder weapon, its silencer, and additional ammunition. When detectives sat down with Pierre Haobsh and gave him the opportunity to explain himself, he talked at length. What he told them had nothing to do with the Hahn family. He claimed his life was in danger. He claimed shadowy figures had been pursuing him for years because of a scientific breakthrough he had invented, a perpetual energy machine that powerful interests wanted suppressed. The Hahn family, he said, had been murdered by those same forces, and according to him, he was being framed. To understand why Pierre Haobsh believed he could get away with what he did, and why he told such extraordinary lies with such apparent conviction, it helps to understand who he was before the murders. In 2012, Pierre was living in a penthouse apartment in a luxury high-rise in Tempe, Arizona. He had arrived in a bright red Ferrari. He told the building manager, Samantha Spidell, that he was an inventor. that he had developed a revolutionary energy technology that was going to change the world, and that serious investors had taken notice. Those investors were real. The investment was real. The technology was not. Pierre Haobsh had convinced a group of high-net-worth investors to finance the development of a perpetual energy machine, a device that, by the laws of physics as they are currently understood, cannot exist. He collected their money, produced nothing of substance, and when the well ran dry, moved on. He sent screenshots of Chase bank statements to various acquaintances showing balances ranging from $3 million to nearly $1 billion. He wasn't a billionaire. He was broke. He claimed connections to classified government programs. He said his father had ties to the CIA. His father did, in fact, have a background in intelligence work, but Pierre had inflated the mythology around it until it became the scaffolding for his entire self-image. He presented himself to Henry Hahn as an experienced laboratory chemist with expertise in CBD processing. He had no college degree. The materials he used in the lab work were toxic. He told Henry he had cancer. He didn't. He was not a scientist. He was not a wealthy inventor. He was not being pursued by the Department of Energy. He was a young man who had spent years constructing an identity out of borrowed credibility and outright fabrication, and who had just run out of money, run out of options, and arrived at the home of a man generous enough to let him back in after he'd already stolen from him. And yet, there is something more unsettling than a pure fraud operating purely for financial gain. On Pierre's own laptop, investigators found his internet search history in the days before the murders. The keylogger he had installed on Henry's computer was also running on his own device. Among those searches, conducted while he was a guest in the Hahn family home, were queries about skull vulnerabilities and ammunition effectiveness. And on the day after the murders, as investigators were processing the crime scene, Pierre Haobsh consulted an online psychic named Count Marco. His question, as prosecutors would later present to the court: "Will I get caught for what I did?" The psychic reportedly wrote back, "Well, what did you do, Pierre?" Pierre Haobsh never answered. Pierre Haobsh was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Given the evidence, he was eligible for the death penalty. At the 11th hour, the district attorney's office agreed to waive death eligibility in exchange for a bench trial, a trial decided by a judge alone rather than a jury. The agreement allowed for a more streamlined process. The trial began on October 25, 2021. More than 5.5 years after the murders, prosecutors laid out their case methodically. The Home Depot purchase, the gun store receipt, the keylogger searches, the failed bank transfers, T.J. Dorada's testimony, the digital trail from the Hahn's phones traveling south, the murder weapon in the trunk of Pierre's car with matching ammunition. They also presented evidence of Pierre's online behavior after leaving the crime scene, searches that, as Latanig argued to the judge, reflected a man who knew exactly what he had done. Defense attorney Christine Voss, who had been assigned to the case through the public defender's office, was in a difficult position. She was representing a client who wanted to be vindicated, not simply to avoid death, but to be believed. Voss raised legitimate questions: discrepancies in GPS location data from Haobsh's devices, concerns about whether the alleged murder weapon perfectly matched the silencer found with it, and pointed questions about T.J. Dorada's delay in contacting authorities, nearly 2 days during which he could theoretically have obtained details about the crime scene. She fought for every available inch of reasonable doubt. Pierre Haobsh took the stand and testified for 3 days. He told the same story he had told detectives on the night of his arrest, with elaborations. The shadowy figures pursuing him were now definitively, he said, agents of the Department of Energy, protecting their interests in the existing energy infrastructure from his revolutionary invention. The evidence against him, the gun, the wrapping materials, Henry's stolen documents, the keylogger searches, was all planted, all of it a frame job. 14 people testified that Pierre Haobsh had fabricated stories about wealth, power, and scientific achievement throughout his adult life. The prosecution's evidence was physical, digital, and corroborated. The defense's central argument rested entirely on the testimony of the defendant, a man whose relationship with the truth had been documented in court as deeply, comprehensively unreliable. On November 24, 2021, Judge Brian Hill returned his verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge stated his ruling was not merely beyond a reasonable doubt. It was, in his words, beyond a shadow of a doubt. On April 15, 2022, Pierre Haobsh stood in a Santa Barbara courtroom to receive his sentence. None of his family members were present. The judge sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison. The autopsies had revealed the full scope of what he had done. Henry had been shot 3 times. Jenny, 3 times. Emily had been shot 8 times. She was 5 years old. If this story moved you, please take a moment to share it. Not for the algorithm. For Henry, for Jenny, and for a 5-year-old girl with a box of crayons and a birthday that never came. Leave a comment below. Share what you remember most about this case or what stayed with you. We read them. If you're new here, we cover true crime with one commitment above all others. The victims come first. Subscribe if that matters to you. And if you or someone you know has experienced fraud, manipulation, or any form of coercive harm, resources are available. The links are in the description below. We'll see you in the next case.